Morning. So it's lovely to have you on our YouTube channel for Geography Department. And I thought I would let yourself introduce yourself a little bit before we look at to what we'll discuss in our mini interview.
Okay, well, hello. I'm Peter Vis, and I worked at the European Commission in Brussels for nearly 30 years, much of that time on climate and energy policy. I am now a senior research associate at the European University Institute in Florence, where I teach a master's course along with other people on global governance issues. And climate change is, of course, a classic example of transnational governance.
So we've got, with my 13s, we've been looking at governance and superpowers this year in term one. And one of the topics we look at is the impact of superpowers on our climate. And although superpowers tend to often be defined as a nation state, so like the USA, China, Brazil, one of the biggest superpower achievements in some sorts has been something you worked on called the ETS, which has been developed by the European Union. So before we go into more details to how it makes the EU superpower, just wanted to say a little bit about what is the ETS, how does it work?
Yeah. Okay, well, ETS stands for Emissions Trading System. And there is, in fact, a UK emissions trading system, and there's an EU emissions trading system, which are very similar because, of course, they were all one until Brexit happened. Only when the UK left the EU did the UK system separate out. So they operate in very much the same way. How does an emissions trading system work? Well, basically, a law is passed that requires large polluting facilities, such as power stations or steel mills, steel works and cement works. It requires them to monitor and report their emissions of greenhouse gases. And mostly we concentrate on CO2, carbon dioxide. And the other thing it does, as well as having to monitor and report their emissions, they have to have an allowance for every ton of emission emitted. So every ton of CO2 emitted, companies have to have an allowance. That's the basic basis of an emissions trading system. And then allowances are made available to companies. Allowances are entitlements, if you like, to emit. Companies are given a certain number for free, or they can buy them from government auctions, or they can buy them from other companies via the carbon markets. 43% of these allowances are given to industry for free to stop industry relocating outside the EU, okay. And 57% are auctioned by governments to the highest bidder. Now, if you're a coal-fired power station, you need to buy a lot of these allowances. Yeah. If you're a renewable energy producer, by contrast, you don't have to buy any. And so today, the allowance price is about 75 euros a ton or 65 pounds a ton of CO2. And that gives renewable energy producers a cost advantage, which encourages further investment in renewable energy.
And am I right in thinking there's a fixed number of tons that can be emitted every year?
That's absolutely right. There is a total number of allowances made available each year, and every year the companies have to report their emissions and hand over to governments the number of allowances that they've got. The total number of allowances made available in the system reduces every year by 2.2%.
Okay.
And it's soon going to increase. Actually, the reduction rate will increase to 4.2%.
Okay.
And this is going to bring down emissions correspondingly, and we're actually going to reach zero. And when there's no more allowances issued, and those that companies already have been used up, there will be no more emissions. We will have managed to decarbonize the sectors covered by the system.
So does that mean, imagine I'm a renewable energy company, do I get given free permits that I can then sell on to a kind of carbon coal-fired power plant, or?
No, basically, the renewable energy companies don't have any obligations under this system because
Okay.
they have no emissions.
They just have to pay the tax in essence.
In other words, they don't have to pay this carbon charge, which the fossil fuel companies are having to pay. The generators using fossil fuels having to buy those allowances, and so that adds to the costs of production of coal-fired electricity. And the producers, of course, put that cost into the price they charge customers. So in the end, it feeds through. But essentially, this system makes polluters pay, and those companies who don't pollute with greenhouse gases, they quite simply just don't have to pay. So it gives them an advantage.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think ultimately one of the biggest impacts we've had a look at is with superpowers, the whole focus is about growth, getting bigger, more powerful as a nation. But in doing that, there's a lot of the time it takes a toll on the environment. So we looked at what the EU was doing with its emission trading scheme. You explained it. Obviously, the EU is a bloc. It's a huge bloc within the global order, and it's in order to find its feet, you could say, compared to the industry of China or the military power of the US, is really trying to push its green credentials to become that kind of green superpower that sets the standard across the world. And I read an article recently saying China wants to copy what the EU's done within its own country. I've seen that the US climate is controversial over there, unfortunately, and so you've got some states that were trying to do their own statewide emission trading scheme because federally it's not. They are worried isn't they're never going to achieve it. So my question to you is: with other countries trying to copy, how successful do you think the ETS has been in Europe? And for those who want to copy, what should they try and avoid doing in order to kind of overcome some of the limitations to the ETS?
Well, look, I think first, has it been successful? It's an obvious question. You've got to ask that. The answer is a very emphatic yes. This system started operation in 2005. Up to 2020, emissions by the installations covered by the emissions trading system had fallen by over 40%.
Okay, that's massive.
Which is a really big amount. Now, of course, 2020 was a year that was impacted by COVID and the sudden confinement and the economic slowdown as a result. But in that single year, of emissions fell at 11%, but they've bounced back as the economy has reopened. So, we'll have to see where we are today. But basically, no other part of the world has managed to achieve from its industry and power sectors a reduction in the order of 40%, 35, 40% in the 15 years that it's been up and running. So it has definitely reduced our emissions. And quite honestly, we have managed since the beginning of the emissions trading system to more or less decouple economic growth from emissions growth. And that's, of course, something that we'd like other countries to do as well. But there are indeed a number of other countries in the world that are copying or implementing a system similar. I wouldn't go so far as to say copying, but I think that the World Bank's latest report on this shows that over a dozen countries or regions of the world are actually operating or are introducing an emissions trading system. And they include China, South Korea, New Zealand, California, Quebec. Those are ones that actually have them. And the ones that are thinking about them include Colombia, Chile, Brazil,
all the emerging economies,
Indonesia, Thailand, and Pakistan, and then of course Ukraine, Turkey, nearer to Europe. So there are a lot of countries all over the world who are trying to benefit from the learning that Europe has managed to do. We were first to go, so of course not everything worked perfectly from the start, but we've definitely been very crucial in demonstrating that this concept of essentially making polluters pay gives a real incentive to reduce pollution.
And what do you think not mistakes, but what could be improved with these newer versions? You said they're not exactly copying, they're doing their own versions. What do you think could be avoided?
Well, to be honest, what countries find difficult to do is to put a price on carbon pollutions, on greenhouse gas pollution. Just putting a price is what, it took a bit of time for us to do that. You have to basically, it's very tempting for companies to give too many allowances to industry, and it means that they don't actually have to do much because they're getting for free an entitlement to pollute, and they're just carrying on polluting. Now China's system is different from Europe's. It's in its relatively early stages. It only covers the electricity generation sector at the moment, but they're giving a lot of these permits, and they're giving them for free, whereas we make our power generators buy these allowances. And they're probably giving too many of these things, really. We'd like them to give less, but that's politically difficult in any jurisdiction. I think in the end, everyone can see what an emissions trading should be, but actually applying that is always politically difficult.
Sensitive, and I think it's also getting people to pay high prices in order because the customer ultimately pays that high price in a time when cost of living is going up. Is probably a hard political sell.
I'd say no country wants to impose additional cost on its industry. They would rather make its industry flourish and prosperous. But in the end, it is a sort of cost that it has to be imposed on the companies, and that will change their behavior.
And I think building on that, saying how other countries are using this example because Europe was at the forefront, there's around superpowers, there's the concept of a power being a sovereign state, a power being China, the USA, Canada, South Africa. To what extent Europe's been trying to find its way, because each individual country within the European Union is quite small on a global scale. Put together, they're one of the largest, wealthiest markets in the world, but it's not a nation state. To what extent do you think the ETS shows Europe, or the EU, to be a superpower? Do you think it's a way for Europe to show this, flex its muscle?
Well, we've done it together, and we've had 28 countries in it. In fact, a few more than 28, because we also include the countries in the European Economic Area. So that's Norway, Iceland, and we've got an agreement with Switzerland where they also are linked to the EU scheme. So actually there's quite a few countries, over 30, involved. It makes good economic sense to do it together because, in fact, in an emissions trading system, it comes down to individual companies, and they think, what could I do to reduce my emissions? And the more companies you've got in your system, the more possibilities there will be to reduce emissions. And so it's basically a system that incentivizes those companies who can do it cheapest to do those investments that will save them making emissions. And it basically is economically rational to do it together. And also, of course, in the European Union, there is an internal market, and we want our cement producers and steel producers, whether they be located in Portugal or Poland, to basically be subject to the same regulation, or there would be some sort of distortion within the country.
And I think in some ways that shows the super national power of the EU on a global stage.
Well, there's a professor at Columbia University called Anna Bradford, who's invented a term called the Brussels effect, where EU standards and practices effectively set global standards, or they at least influence the setting of global standards. And why, you might ask, would the other countries follow the EU's example in having an emissions trading system, for example? Well, first, they too want to do something about climate change, or air pollution, or safety of chemicals, or whatever their regulatory area is. And then foreign companies, as you mentioned before, they want to sell goods into the European market because it's a big, developed, wealthy market. And so setting European standards that basically have to be complied with to be allowed to sell goods here is a classic example, if you like. Would be CO2 and cars. New cars have to comply with CO2 standards. And if you want to sell new cars and vans in the EU, you have to comply with those standards. And that's the sort of example of the Brussels effect. and it's happening in the case of new vehicles, but it's also happening in the case of emissions trading to some extent. We're showing how we do things,
I think
and that scale matters.
We've noticed this in the UK. Obviously, since Brexit, things have changed slightly. But even with us, this divergent, we still hear about the GDPR, which was created by the EU. The UK has basically copied it. Other countries want to do the same. It's the same with climate targets. The EU sets a lot of the trends, which to some extent you could argue makes it a superpower globally. But I think
it's always, I would never sort of, superpowers are sort of a big word. One tends to think of military power at the forefront of the list, and we're not perhaps a superpower in that sense, but then perhaps we are.
Yeah, so it's good. You're absolutely right. Superpower, everybody thinks the kind of Cold War USSR versus the USA. But what the year 13s learn about 6 different criteria. And they range from military power, GDP, physical size, population size, and I think economic might. And I think the EU ticks a lot of these boxes, not necessarily military, but ticks a lot of the other boxes. And I think you also mentioned the fact what helps Europe thrive is the fact as a trade bloc, they're huge population and they're incredibly wealthy. And I think that leads on to another question, which was a actual 20 marker I made a student to write, which is what's the responsibility of low-income countries in climate change? So we currently very topically have COP27. COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, which I know you've in the past gone to a lot of the COPs as a negotiator for the EU. But what I asked my students, and we had a debate about it, and they got quite heated, is should low-income countries, and you said, because you mentioned economic growth often is correlated with CO2 emissions. I think I remember you in the past sending me a graph about this, which I might try and show again. And therefore, we can presume that with growing populations in emerging countries like India, like China, I think 60% of the world's people live in Asia. We've just reached 8 billion people on a planet as of this morning. This is going to continue. It's going to slow down. It's going to continue. As it continues, they're going to emit more and more CO2. The question I asked my year 13 is, should they be allowed to keep polluting in order to develop and pull people out of poverty? What's your thinking on that?
Well, the short answer is, I would say yes. The developing worlds, and in particular the least developed countries, should be allowed to develop. And ideally, they should do so in a way that does not pollute as much as the West polluted when the West developed. We basically industrialized, for the last 150, 200 years. And in that time, we've made a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, most of which are still up there in the atmosphere because they take a long time to decompose. So our historical contribution to climate change is obviously high. Now, can we expect poor countries, people in poor countries, not to develop as we've done? I mean, development, of course, is still about eating enough, having enough to eat, having safe drinking water, being able to benefit from education and enjoy access to healthcare and things like that. Development should really be a primary human right. And really, why should one person be entitled to develop more than another? I think at the end of the day, there is no justification for that. So we have to, if you like, try to help the least developed countries develop in such a way that they can develop in a cleaner way than we did. And there are more technologies available today than was the case 100 years ago.
Yes, for sure.
Take the example of renewable energy technologies. These technologies are now competitive in many countries. So building a new gas or a coal-fired power station just isn't economic in many places in the world, thanks to the falling technological costs of solar. And I
was going to say that's one of the biggest issues. You can't expect a place like the Maldives or the Fiji or Tuvalu to start building fields and fields of solar power, solar energy fields, when they might not necessarily have the capital for it. And in the case of these island states, they don't necessarily have the land space for that either.
That's right. I mean, those particular vulnerable countries are in a really bad place right now, because there will be a certain sea level rise as a result of climate change, and we can't stop it. So that will happen, and some of these countries are really being threatened to the point of their survival and existence. The discussion going on at COP27 now, and I was literally at a meeting, but an online meeting earlier today, it's primarily about finance, because the fact is that the rich world does have funds that the poorest countries say should be used to, help them decarbonize, but also help them adapt to climate change, protect themselves insofar as they can protect themselves, but also to compensate. The poorest countries now claim, in effect, compensation for the damage that is being done to their livelihoods and their well-being as a result of climate change. Now that is, the technical term is, they're claiming for loss and damage. And the Americans and the Europeans are very reluctant to admit, as it were, liability, mainly because they don't know how big that liability is. It scares them. So there's a lot of discussion about money, but remember, money, of course, buys the ability to protect yourself, or if need be, locate the inhabitants of one island somewhere else, if these sorts of things are going to happen in the future. And the technologies, meanwhile, are getting cheaper. So battery development might be another example of technology that enables off-grid energy supply instead of diesel generators. It's all very well having a solar panel on the roof, but at night you need the battery pack downstairs to sort of keep the lights on during the nighttime hours. And those sorts of things are becoming more and more prevalent and affordable. And, there are ways that we can help the least developed countries develop more sustainably than we did.
And I think that's kind of, from when they learn about climate change, students often learn about key dates like the Kyoto Protocol. They learn about the Copenhagen Accords, I think they were called, in 2009, and Paris Agreement in 2015. I think Paris Agreement was the first COP, and that was, what was it, COP24 or something?
It was the COP.
And it was the first one where it became legally binding. Is that it? That countries had to pay high-income countries had to pay low-income countries.
Well, I think all of that had been prefigured in the Kyoto Protocol, and indeed the Climate Convention initially in 1992 was the first international.
It was in Rio,
1992 in Rio, the Earth Summit, it was called. They adopted two conventions, one the Climate Convention and one the Biodiversity Convention, and they're still both operating at the moment. The Kyoto Protocol was a protocol to that Climate Convention. The Kyoto Protocol is now expired and being replaced by the Paris Agreement, which is so important because it's open-ended. It's a different sort of architecture. You're teaching about it. I'm actually teaching about this in the master's course that I give in Florence. So, it's definitely important because it does commit all countries. There aren't very binding consequences if countries don't want to do things that they promised to do. We saw the US even left the Paris Agreement and then joined it again. And it can leave without consequences. And this is the worrying thing about the UN system, but it does rely on peer pressure and consensus. And we've got to hope that everyone understands that this is a collective problem, but we can also only solve it collectively. And I think everyone's interest.
That leads me to the last question, really, which is, you were talking about how it's a collective problem. You also said how low-income countries should be allowed to pollute in order to grow. And because I think Sustainable Development Goal number 1 of the UN is no poverty by 2030. For that matter, you have to develop, and you therefore will have to create some short-term CO2 emissions in order to pull people out of poverty. So do you think it means are high-income countries, as a result of their legacy, the only ones responsible for tackling climate change? Do you think it's fair to say, well, you polluted, you now have to deal with the consequence? Let's say, I remember the picture of COP last year, actually, before Glasgow. I think it was a Tuvalu minister who made a speech. He had his feet in water with his
Podium was in the water.
Yeah, and he was saying my country's sinking, and it's a visual image of he's done nothing. I think Tuvalu as a world emission must be trivial.
Yeah.
So do you think it all comes down to how is solely the responsibility of high-income countries to tackle climate change and help low-income countries, or is it not that simple?
Well, look, you're absolutely right that you can't blame small island states like Tuvalu for climate change. They've contributed practically nothing to it, but they're being impacted massively.
Yeah.
And so, there is, if you like, they will be doing what they can do to try and protect themselves from extreme weather events, rising sea levels and so on. But they've really contributed the least, and they're bearing the disproportionate share of the impacts. So I think it falls to high-income countries to primarily help first act themselves in a way to try and resolve the problem, but also to help the international community as a whole, because these high-income countries are richer, they have more ability to act, they can afford for themselves more subsidies for energy efficiency, more public transport, more innovation, and they can help poor countries both adapt and acquire cleaner technologies. So I think it's true that everyone should act to address climate change according to their means. Most effort might reasonably be expected of high-income countries who've historically contributed most to this human-induced climate change. And, that sort of onus of responsibility is something that the European Union has never contested. And indeed, the European Union and the UK too, is very proactive and very ambitious in terms of target setting. And we're right now in Europe in the process of making targets for 2030, but that would be a 55% net reduction of CO2, and aiming for net zero in 2050. Net zero in 2050, something the UK subscribes to too. These are very ambitious targets, and they're going to require a lot of further effort by the high-income countries as well. But if we can't do it, we can hardly expect less wealthy countries to do it.
I think one of my year 13s in the debate, they were often saying how you could say controversially, when high-income countries emitted, the science wasn't there. We didn't necessarily know what we were doing. Whereas a high-income, I think, for example, China is the market in the world where there's the highest concentration of electric cars anyway, hands down. But I think more than the majority of their electricity is created by burning coal, which you think that's ironically plugging your electric car into a coal-fired power plant. They know that arguably you could say China knows that what they're doing is bad. Do you think they're doing enough in there? Because I know clearly the high-income countries are tackling as much as they can. Arguably, they could do more. Do you think emerging markets like India, China, Mexico, Brazil are doing enough?
I think the emerging economies, like those you mentioned, the BRICS, are sometimes talked about, but they may be, South Africa, Brazil, India, these sorts of countries, they're hugely significant. I mean, for example, India now, you said the population was going to soon exceed China's. Its emission, it's the third biggest emitter in the world.
As a country.
The US, as a country. After the US, first it's China as the biggest emitter, then it's US, then it's India. So and Brazil is obviously a significant economy, and so on, South Africa too. So these are countries that are going to have to step up and assume responsibility, not just for their own emissions, but also helping the rest of the world develop. And I think China is accepting that point. China is committing itself to carbon neutrality in 2060.
I think India, did they say 2070? I think
they did indeed.
Because I know they've got huge populations. You compare the US per capita and China per capita, is ridiculous difference.
Particularly, I mean, I think the US per capita emissions are high. Canada's are even higher, actually, and a few oil-producing states like Oman have extremely Qatar. They have very high emissions per capita. But Europe is actually about the same level as China today. China's emissions per capita are about the same as Europe, partly because they use so much coal-fired power electricity. But of course, China is also producing solar panels and wind turbines that are being deployed across the world, and indeed in China. So they are, if you like, the factory of a lot of the decarbonizing technologies. And I think electric batteries and cars are actually something that China is quite big on. So we've got to, China is going to decarbonize, it's committed to do so, and it's hoping to peak its emissions by 2030. I really think they do see the problem that I said peak emissions, then they will start coming down. And then they've got to come down extremely steeply through to 2060. But they are putting in place both the production of technologies, the capability, perhaps they've got more capability than Europe has, but they're also putting in place policy instruments. You mentioned that they do have an emissions trading system in China, and they have renewable energy goals and policies as well. So China's probably going to move fast when it starts moving, and indeed
it has done in a lot of different areas.
But they are by far the largest emitter in the world, per capita and in absolute terms. Not per capita at the moment, but in absolute terms, they're the largest emitter.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think it's it's a very complex topic, and I think it's very superpower and environment are growing whilst protecting the planet is hard, and who's to blame is not necessarily straightforward. So I know we haven't necessarily answered all, we haven't come up to a full conclusion, but I think I just wanted to show students how, even for you as an expert who's worked at in the Commission on climate change, it's not necessarily straightforward. So thank you very much for your time today. If I've got any questions, I might contact you again with a few questions from students if they have anything to ask. But thank you very much.
I'll gladly reply to them. Okay, thanks then.